Apple integrating with OpenAI is such a privacy threat that he's going to stop his employees from using Apple devices.
Look, that's a great segue, Yaniv, because we wanted to talk about this. For whatever reason on this show, I've been the guy who just kind of is happy to bash on Elon a bit. He has done so many important things for the world. Moving the conversation about EV forward, building rockets, untethering the US from Russian dependency for getting to the International Space Station, helping us imagine and dream bigger. I'll call that old Elon. New Elon, red pill Elon, is a classless, inarticulate, tasteless troll.
Tell us what you really think.
No, it's so frustrating to see a hero or to see someone who has so much capacity for change and good to just like perform stunts and stupidity in public. And his laugh has even become like some kind of evil mastermind. It's like, dude, have a holiday. Have a holiday and see a therapist because please, this stupid stuff, his X exists by the grace of God. Apple App Store allows it to exist. So just hold your tongue, focus on value creation and stop being a troll, please. It's just such a waste of time.
I'm going to reserve my comments until my arbitration with Elon and all.
These comments do not represent Amir and his thoughts and are completely separate and different. Ellie, what do you reckon? Am I overstating the Elon trollishness?
No, not at all. I couldn't agree more. I think that this transformation that we've seen is absolutely stunning, shocking, terrifying. All of the above. And, I think we've seen it in a number of different tech leaders. And I think, to me, what I take away from it is I look at what are the lessons that can be gleaned from one individual really having such a great amount of control over emerging technologies and industries. So Elon having such intense oversight and control over the EV market, over space exploration, over these really key areas for innovation. And I think we have to take lessons from what can happen from actors who seem like well-intentioned, well-balanced, well-adjusted individuals today. And we don't know how that can develop. And I think what we need to do is look at someone like Sam Altman. Today, he has a lot of power, but there was quite a bit of news about his investments recently and just how many of his investments are now making partnerships with OpenAI for their AI model development. And I think we have to take what lessons we can from the Elon story and saga. And we have quite a short memory, it seems, collectively. And if we can zoom out, take a look at the last 10 years, 5 years even, and say, okay, well, what can we learn from that? And then how can we actually implement some real safeguards to disperse some of that power? And maybe ultimately it would help someone like that. Maybe Elon wouldn't have gone down this path if some of the power was not quite so concentrated.
I think there's two things here, right? One is, should so much power be concentrated in the hands of any one individual? And Ellie, I think you're rightly saying, ideally not. I think that creates existential risk for the world because any one individual can have a lot of vested interest, can have mental health issues, can have anything go wrong with them, and then we're somewhat beholden to them. I think Elon as an individual is a particularly odd version of that story because he is simultaneously still doing a lot of good in the world. Like SpaceX is still an incredible story, right? Like the businesses he's running, with the exception of X, arguably, are still doing good stuff.
Neuralink, it's terrifying. Neuralink is terrifying, but amazing. It's incredible. Look at what he's done.
Neuralink, Starlink.
Starlink, yeah.
Incredible stuff. And at the same time, he talks like a total fucking moron on his own platform on X. And it's like, how is this the same person? The story arc traditionally is you do good and then, you have your like Darth Vader turning to the dark side moment. Elon is simultaneously like a Jedi and a Sith. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on here.
I don't know. Do you think that there's people around him that are doing a lot of the good now? Like, I wonder, he's not an individual who's sitting in the seat anymore, writing code and doing the development. Like, I do wonder, he's got to have people.
Yeah.
He's got people doing stuff around him. It's not just him.
There's a great team around him doing great stuff, and we need to be careful about the cult of individual personality, right? But I'm skeptical about your premise, Yaniv, which is that he's doing such good. I think he's also wielding that power in ways that are actually not healthy. Like he's skirting FTC laws and trade commission laws. And he knows that the US government is dependent on him for defense, for Starlink, for just his general brand of brilliance and what he represents as a national security threat. I think he says things and does things that I think others don't necessarily get away with. His tweets that move the stock price and stuff. And I think he's playing with that and can continue to play with that in ways that are not healthy. I want to connect this to a bit of a larger thing. This is now getting a little bit further away from tech, but it really just speaks to this tendency we're having lately around cults of personality. When we agree with the person, we're enthusiastic about them and we're like, yeah, you go and you bash heads and get stuff done. And this is true for the left, I think, with Elon. It's true for the right with Trump. But any individual wielding power that is subversive to democracy, and again, I say Elon is a national security threat to a degree where I think he's starting to push himself outside of some accountability. It's just dangerous. Whether you agree with Trump or not, the power that he's wielding is unhealthy for democracy. If you agree with Elon or not, as formerly, I guess, a liberal champion, now some other weird right-wing champion, that power over these major industries is very dangerous. There are laws to stop companies from wielding this kind of power in markets. It's called antitrust laws. I don't believe there are laws to stop individuals from wielding that kind of power. And so the connective tissue between these initiatives is Elon, not a parent company. And I don't know if there's any good mechanisms for reining in that power when the individual is the one facilitating the cross-pollination versus a corporate entity.
We had for a while, it was called the guillotine.
Oh, God.
Whoa, my
No,
goodness.
I'm saying that's how.
That's not admissible in arbitration, folks.
No, but I'm saying we had, like, when people had too much power, people just went after them. There's a great story in Greek mythology about a person getting a invisibility ring, and he's all good. And the first thing he does when he gets this invisibility ring is kill the king and marry the queen. So, like, abusing power is something that has been throughout our history. And rich people have been always mobbed. And I think it's not the right way to do things. The right way to do it is through laws. If we don't have laws, we will go back to war and other means that are very, very bad. So I think that in the same way, to your point, Chris, we have laws to protect us from too much power of organization. We will need laws protecting us from too much power of a single person.
Maybe just one last point on this. I think there is an argument to be made that maybe Sam Altman is a very clever Machiavellian character who says all the right things, but is self-dealing, placating.
I think that argument has been made.
Yes, and I think, he comes across as quite meek and thoughtful, but is actually doing things that are quite aggressive and ruthless. I think there's a reasonable reason to believe that. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's a reasonable reason to believe that. But at least he has enough EQ and enough self-control and enough thoughtfulness to do it with such delicacy and diplomacy that he is outwardly like that. I'm always weirdly...
Yeah, but if one accepts that premise, Chris, that makes him more dangerous.
That's more terrifying. Yeah.
I agree it makes him more dangerous, but it makes him more sensitive to the needs or the perceptions or the calculations of other people, which makes him more dangerous in terms of exerting his will, but at least he has some empathy for other people.
He's avoiding he's avoiding the guillotine, right?
Whereas an Elon or even a Trump, again, let's say for the sake of argument, you agree with all of his policies, but he doesn't have the empathy or the intelligence to articulate himself in a way that is consumable by many. That, to me, is kind of disqualifying in a leader. Is like, you must be able to have enough empathy to at least mask your psychopathy. It seems like a basic requirement.
Yeah, well, I think that ultimately there are many Americans who would disagree and say that his rhetoric speaks directly to them, right? And I think that's why, obviously, we have the situation that we have today, and what the next 4 months will hold for us will be really, really interesting. But I think that I'm fundamentally an optimist, for better or worse. I believe that people can hold two things at once. And I think that Elon is actually an example of this, for better or worse. He can still believe in an EV revolution and building a more sustainable planet, and also have some weird belief that he's supposed to populate the planet. Like, I don't know if you guys have heard about this, where he's like, you can hold two things at once. And I think Sam Altman can hold two things at once. I think he can truly believe the AI models that he's building are going to revolutionize and democratize education, for example, or create solutions to healthcare problems that we've been trying to find for decades. Otherwise, he wouldn't do what he's doing. He can also be a self-led actor that is taking steps to reassure his own existence and success in society, because that's what we do as animals. And I think that both can be true. And I know we're not really going to talk about the whistleblower letter, but the one thing that I would say is just that there are individuals that are really calling for a very reasonable system of checks and balances. And you said that there's no way right now, like if we talk about antitrust, we can talk about organizational checks and balances, but there are ways to set up a reasonable system of checks and balances whereby safety is governed by an external party that would then be able to, in much the same way, assess the actions of individuals within an organization. And I think that that's totally reasonable. And I think that there's one really good example, which was I was living in Los Angeles during the Black Lives Matter movement, and the body cams that came out of that movement were not governed by an external party in terms of reviewing their footage. And in most jurisdictions, they had no real impact, except for in one jurisdiction in Chicago, where they had actually put in a third-party governing body to review the footage. And it was that jurisdiction where the body cams on police actually had quite an impact in police violence, and how that movement actually got to see real changes. At least some data has pointed to it. And I think that this is a perfect example where you can't have a system self-governing internally. And I think that's really what a lot of people are calling for. And I think that it's the same for individuals, whether they're inside an organization or outside.
I want to double down on that. I think that that's a great point. I think the essence of our conversation is that power should be checked and should be checked by a third party and create balance. And my example with the guillotine is an extreme, like if you do so much bad, people will come and kill you. That's a very bad example. But if you have checks and balances, like having cameras, like having laws, like having all these checks and balances, makes us better humans because there's accountability for the actions that we take. And what we're seeing is good people without any accountability start doing bad things. So we need to add more accountability and more checks and balances.
I think it's worth pointing out that he hasn't actually done anything demonstrably actually bad. He's not like murdering people. He's just a lot of like crazy rhetoric, right? And stuff that just feels trollish and what he retweets and that sort of thing. And so it does seem like power is concentrating, wealth is concentrating, and this idea that we need mechanisms to provide checks and balances to individuals seems like an interesting thing to discuss. But we just got to be careful about overstating things, right?
Well, I think this is a perfect transition actually into our next topic. The question of whether he's done anything that's actually bad, I think, is up for debate. You know, when we start to look at his recent maneuver to make explicit content available and shareable on X, I think that there are a lot of arguments to be made that this is actually and demonstrably bad. Twitter is responsible for 49% of child sexual abuse content that's found across social media, and search engines and cloud services from 2017 to 2019. So that's before AI. Having said that, Twitter holds single-digit market share across social media, but owns half the child sexual abuse content. This is not a good ratio for Twitter. And I think that this is a huge question about the direction that he's taking X and the implications for society. You know, people can't walk around the mall with no pants on. You'd be booked for indecent exposure. Our society works under these social contracts. If X was meant to be the town hall, they don't hold the right to subject me to explicit pornographic content at their will just because of, in my opinion, just because of free speech. Just the same way that you can't make me watch someone masturbate on the subway. It doesn't work like that. You know, I think we have to think about these digital spaces as akin to physical spaces, and the way that we currently govern physical spaces under these social contracts has existed for a really long time. So I don't think it's fair for people to say, well, if you don't want to see that, don't go on X or don't use the subway. No, society's built to serve people, and our social contracts and systems of governance are there to serve those people. One person's violent actions or ideologies shouldn't remove the right of other people to utilize a public good or service. And this is true in the town hall of X, and this is true on the public transport system of the subway. I think it's extremely dangerous what he's doing.
I think that's a really valid point. And I think that free speech absolutism is a naive ideology in the same way as kind of basic libertarianism is a naive ideology, because it doesn't accept the nuances and complexity of what it takes to live together as humans in a society. X has been trending like this for quite some time. You know, I've led a sheltered and privileged life and not encountered much anti-Semitism in my life until the last 6 months on X. I'm like, holy shit, it's just like a fucking bunch of Nazis saying whatever they like, and that's okay, right? And yeah, that is not a town square, right? That is just a pit of like race to the bottom nastiness. And yeah, making porn officially part of it is not going to help at all.
You guys are going to put me in an awkward position of defending Elon Musk and pornography. So, but let me try to do this delicately.
Always fun to defend pornography as a man. Hey, Chris.
Yeah, I know. It's not a good spot. Not a good look. Okay. So putting aside, of course, the very disgusting, dangerous, unacceptable child exploitation, Nazis and so on, let's put all that aside in a different category, okay? Let's talk about properly created with consent between adults, etc., pornography, and also like OnlyFans type stuff where girls have chosen to do that for themselves, their own small business or what have you. I do think the majority of these companies and brands avoid it because of brand. And that forces it to go to dedicated platforms like a Pornhub or an OnlyFans. But I do think that the US in particular, and many Western countries, have this puritanical relationship with sex, which is overstated and overplayed and overwrought, again, to use that word, that I think is just not true in some European countries and some other cultures where it's like, sex is just part of life. And I believe, and I'm not an expert on this, there's evidence also that like making prostitution and things illegal only makes it unsafe for sex workers and all this kind of stuff. And so I really think this kind of knee-jerk reaction to sex content, sex workers is unhealthy for society, and I think it's repressive. On the other side, Ellie, to deal with your very real concerns, I would say Elon would argue, and again, here's where I'm in the uncomfortable position of defending him, he wants everything on the platform, and then he wants to give you client-side filtering, consumption-side filtering. So I would imagine, and I'm just reading the article about it, where you have to label the content as adult and so on. And so one would presume you could say, I want to see sensitive content or not, I want to see adult content or not, the default is not, etc., etc. So in theory, one would imagine you're not being forced to look at anything, not in a binary like, well, then don't look at X, but in a sense of like, you can participate in, clean X and not necessarily have this other stuff just pop up in your field arbitrarily and randomly.
You got to have Kleenex, or make sure you got a box of Kleenex, right?
Kleenex. But I think that's the argument for, right? I think the argument for is Elon keeps thinking about things as first principles. And again, he's trollish, he's inarticulate, he's belligerent, and he doesn't express himself well, and it pisses me off. But there's some times when I think first principles thinking about like, what is the problem here? If again, men and women, consenting adults, want to monetize their bodies, monetize their sexuality, consume sexuality, what's the problem? Market as adult, allow people to subscribe, move on with their lives.
I hear you, and I think a lot of the core principles that you say are good, but I'm with Ellie on this. I think if you have a tool that is mainly about the public conversation, and as you said, there are tools for the rest of, like for porn, there's a lot of like very highly monetizing. So if you wanted to do xxx.com, that could have been a great application.
It's great.
But for X, just one X, the public conversation, I want it to be slightly cleaner, slightly more to the point, slightly less anti-Semitic, slightly less racist. I think it's a great tool for democracy and a great tool for humanity to have a strong, healthy public conversation. And I want that tool dedicated for that. And once you have different dedication for the same tool, the tool sucks, right? And becomes a lesser of a tool. And I think as a person who worked at Twitter and really believes in the mission of the public conversation, I think that I'm okay with not having porn there. I wish he would open xxs.com and leave X clean.
I think we're in violent agreement. I think that I deeply agree with engaging in the conversation of sex. That's incredibly important, and there's many cultures that do it so much better than North America. There are incredible sources of data that do confirm what you said, that legalizing sex workers makes it more safe. And we can look at that also in the conversation around legalization of certain explicit drugs as well, and have that as an entire conversation. But I think that the town hall is really as functional as the individuals on it. There's a network effect. And if there is a certain predominant group that's attracted to the platform because of these types of changes, it does inherently change the conversation. I think, to me, I see this as a nail in the coffin for X. I think it's really tragic. I think if Twitter used to be a trusted and legitimate platform for everyone from journalists and working professionals and colleagues to express ideas and comedy and maybe some political rhetoric, for sure, those days I think are gone, because now if you are introducing really explicit pornographic material on this platform in a real way, it's like, I'm not going to put my X handle at the end of this podcast and say, go and follow me on X, because I don't want to show up next to that kind of content. And to me, I think that I see right through this in some ways. I think this shows how desperate Elon is for users. I think that we know adding explicit content increases monetization. You can look at the history of Tumblr. Tumblr was inherently a porn site, and the moment they were forced to take porn down, its value went from 1.1 billion to 3 million. And I think that there's, I would say, a more realist view that I take about why he's doing this, and he can put it under the guise of free speechism. But I think that ultimately he's doing it under these grossly veiled pretenses of free speech, but it's just a desperate grab for daily active users, and I think it's pathetic. I certainly believe in increasing the conversation around sex and sex work for safety. I think it's completely different when you're talking about individuals who are creating their own content versus a generative AI world. A world in which generative AI can take the likenesses of one individual and create explicit content against their will. This is not only wrong, but it puts kids in harm's way. There was a recent podcast episode from the New York Times and the Daily telling the story of a teen bullying situation using Nudify apps in high schools where the boys are creating all of this explicit materials of their female peers. And I'm terrified about that. I don't have kids yet, but I'm terrified for that world.
But I do think this is a slightly orthogonal topic though, Ellie. Like, I think protecting women and girls and everybody from fake content, fake news, the use of their image is an important topic, but I think it's related to society in general, platforms in general, private chat rooms, WhatsApp and whatever, between kids where they might be creating all sorts of things to bully each other online. I think it's slightly different than the question of, is pornography, hate speech, and other content that is less desirable or outright disgusting, is it part of the public conversation? And is suppressing it constructive or destructive to the conversation? Again, I'm in a very awkward position here because I don't like a lot of what Elon has done. And there's a very subtle nuance that I'm trying to draw. Amir, I so fully believe in Twitter as the product that the Twitter company couldn't kill. Elon's changes have been mostly destructive. People don't want to be in an uncomfortable platform. These are all things I believe. But there's a subtlety, a line here on the spectrum where curating the town hall turns into suppressing important parts of society and speech, such that we live in this kind of bubble where we pretend hate speech or other kinds of undesirable things don't exist. There is an argument for bringing some of it into the light and having those people debate and discuss if it was done with more class and taste than Elon is currently doing it with. And I just don't think he's doing it particularly well.
And I think that's the thing that I really would like to say, which is that I think it really matters who is the one leading that charge. I think it really does matter who's the person behind it. And frankly, how much empathy, to bring it back to that discussion about empathy and social awareness and understanding of our social contracts and our systems of governance that we've developed and that we all live by. I think that matters who it's coming from. And I think it matters across a lot of different spaces. So I personally believe that it is the same for violent rhetoric, by the way, between explicit content like porn or violent rhetoric. Just because you have the right to free speech doesn't mean you have the right to diminish my safety in a public space. I also believe that it's really important to have town halls. I also believe, I can hold all of these things at once. I also believe that the way that the internet and social media has changed the ability for individuals who have extremist ideologies to connect with each other in communities that hasn't existed previously, where they used to, yes, they were in silos and disconnected around the world and they were not talking to each other. And now they found this group of other individuals with their shared beliefs and ideologies. So I can hold all of those things at once.
I've got actually an interesting analog, which speaks to your point, Ellie, that it often has to do with the character of the company and the people leading the company and the way in which it's implemented and the amount of trust that people have in it. So Google, the search engine, has had porn freely available and hate speech freely available for a long time. And, it's so normalized now that nobody thinks about it. There were some controversies about it in the mid-2000s when Google was becoming a more popular search engine. But because they had principles and then they had some subtlety and nuance about how they implemented porn. So I actually worked next to the so-called porn team at Google when I was back there in Zurich. And it was funny, they were the most buttoned up people, which I guess they had to be to have legitimacy. And their principle was, if you're searching for porn, you should get porn. If you're searching for not porn, you should never get porn. And that was like their core principle, right? And similarly with hate speech, I remember, there was some issue around like anti-Semitic websites, and they took out ads on their own platform to say, this is why we allow this stuff, but we don't censor things. And because they had clear principles and clear ways of trying to make this safe, people accepted it. Now, Elon Musk, we're sort of one constituency here, but I don't trust the guy. And I think, Ellie, that's where you're coming from too. It's like when Elon says we're going to have porn on Twitter, there's no sense that he's going to be thinking about how to make it safe, because he talks like a free speech absolutist and there's no room for that nuance there.
Yeah, I think that just to connect to what you're saying, Yaniv, when we were at Google, there was this principle of do no evil. I don't think that that's a principle in X. I think doing evil is somewhat of a principle in what's happening on Twitter right now, on the actual conversation. So an evil conversation actually is promoted. I think you're 100% right. You need to have some opinionated approach in order to do this right. And empathy is key here.
I will say, inexplicably, having dialed my usage of X all the way to 0 almost, I would start getting notifications from right-wing commentators, breaking crazy right-wing conspiracy proven, breaking blah, blah, blah. And it does actually feel like some of this stuff is being promoted in a weird way. I do think, though, what you said, Yaniv, is so, so important, because one of the things I really want from our show is to be careful about these knee-jerk reactions of like, that's bad, that's good, and the Frogut is free, but it's cursed. And it's like, I think you're right. There's such a subtlety here, which is what you were describing around Google does it, but we trust Google, and we trust them to have nuance and sophistication around this. And so why couldn't someone we trust with subtlety and nuance and taste and judgment do this on a platform like X? If it's the town hall, if it's the town square, well, guess what? Down that alleyway in the town square, there is the red light district. And down there are the people who are talking hate speech. And down there are the aristocrats. And down there are the intellectuals, right? And those down there are the psychedelics, right? They're all in the town. They're all in our town. If we were to trust the person in charge and trust their motives and trust their capacity for delicate execution, I think we would feel less badly about this. And I want that nuance. I like that this group of people can tease that nuance out, that there's more to this than just hate speech bad. And I think that's a really important thing. And you were saying, Ellie, they didn't have a place to connect. And that's the part where I'm disagreeing. I think, no, they were connected on forums and on 4chan and other things. At least this is now in the light. It's visible. And with the right subtleties, the right delicacy, the right filters, you should be able to control your experience on X. Can Elon Musk build that experience? I don't know, and I don't think so. So it might be a moot point anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want the nuance too. And I think that those things, I think that they do exist in the town. And it's important to be able, we have to find ways to reduce silos and reduce echo chambers. And if we only have specific platforms for specific groups talking within their specific ideologies, then those echo chambers and those silos only persist and get worse. And I think it is incredibly important to have shared spaces and shared ideology and be able to exist in violent agreement or respectful disagreement or engage in conversations. I think that's incredibly important. I think that elections should be the way that we find individuals who we trust to govern and create those spaces both in the real world and online. Democratic process should be the way that we do that. I think that there's a difference between selecting and choosing content. Like Google's had massive flubs, obviously, in the last year around prompt adjustments and things to be able to try to create a more woke, for lack of a better term, AI model. And I think there's a difference between choosing and making that choice for you versus regulating and creating a safe environment. And I think that they're trying to figure that out, and all of them are. But I think if you don't believe that some action is safe in the real world, out in a face-to-face environment, IRL, then it's not safe online for the public. And I think that we have to find a way to bring the experiences of our IRL into digital space. I think that's the answer, because I think if you don't believe that it's safe for someone to take some certain action in a public sphere, like on the subway, then it's probably not safe for them to be able to take a similar action. And so if we look at the real world, okay, we've all agreed more or less what we can and can't do in the real world. Let's try to find ways to mimic that online. And I think if you had someone who had nuance and empathy and someone that I trusted, yeah, absolutely.
So with that, join us in the comments and tell us what you think. Are you more leaning towards that, hey, the town square needs to involve everything happening in town, including pornography and hate speech? Or is it really about curating a safe space for everybody to have a conversation? Get down there in the comments, join the debate, and we'll join you down there and have a discussion.